Hey guys, quickly before we get into the video, I want to thank our monthly subscribers, Greg Smith with the $20, Davey with the $10, and Mrs. Mo 3D with the $3. Thank you guys, we appreciate you, and if you guys also want to support us, check out our Patreon link in the description. And guys, we want to thank you guys for reaching 5,000 subscribers. We just hit it yesterday and we are really happy and excited about this. So thank you guys for all the support and let's go to 10,000 subscribers. Okay, bye bye. Hello guys and welcome to this tutorial about the Unreal Engine multiplayer framework basics. So basically in the last videos, the first video in this series actually, we talked about what sessions are and how players can basically host matches and then other players how they can find those hosted matches and join them. So here we see how somebody can create a session, then he becomes online and available for other people to join, and then the other person can basically click on find sessions, find that session, and then join that player in multiplayer. So what we learned in this first video is basically how people can connect to each other in multiplayer games. Then in our second video, we took a look at replication basics. So I've set up this little map over here. And in this video, we talked about what replication is. So we looked at the term replication, how you can have an original and then replicate the original. Then in this video, we also took a look at an actual example of how replication applies. So how you have a server instance and how that server instance then basically replicates to the clients to keep them all in sync with the server state. Then once we understood the concept of replication, we also took a quick look in this video about how replication is actually applied in our engine. So we took a look at how we can turn replication on. We took a look at replicated variables and rep notifies, and we took a look at what remote procedure calls are, RPCs, in order to have the client communicate back to the server and also to have the server broadcast information to all of the clients. So now that we have a good understanding of all of these basics for multiplayer, how we can connect to each other and overall the replication concept in our engine, I want to take you guys through the framework and the most important classes when it comes to Unreal Engine multiplayer. So let's hop right in that. Alright, so the first thing basically, when you start a level in Unreal Engine, you see that here on the right we have a world settings tab, and if you do not have this tab, then you can click here on window and then over here you can open up the world settings. And what we see in that tab is that basically here a game mode is defined, and what we see is that a game mode contains all of our other classes. So there's classes in here like a default pawn class, a class like a player controller, GameState, PlayerState. So what are these classes and why are they relevant, and what should we basically code where? Because I can, for example, trigger that widgets will start on my pawn class and then be created, but I can also do that in the player controller. So what to code where and how do these classes relate to each other is what we're basically going to take a look at for this video. So the first thing that I want to do is basically create a folder over here, and let's call it core. And inside of core, we are going to be creating the essential classes for multiplayer. So the first one that's always important, if we right click here in the content browser and click on blueprint class, is our game mode class. So quickly, what is a game mode? Well, as it says over here, a game mode defines the game being played, the rules of the game. You can also keep track of things such as scoring and other facets of the game type. And in reality, when it comes to rules and scoring, for example, you would only use the game mode to actually award score. So you would only program basically the rules of your game instead of actually keeping track of what the score is here. So the first thing we have to do is create a game mode, but there is two types of game modes in our engine. So there is a game mode base class, but if we click here on all classes and type in game mode, then we see that in this hierarchy over here we have game mode base, but we also have a game mode class. And the difference between these two is in the beginning there only existed a game mode class, and the game mode class was actually intended for multiplayer match based games. It also says so when you hover over this. Behaves like a multiplayer match based game. It has default behavior for picking spawn points and match state. Basically, inside of this game mode class, we have a couple of events which we do not have inside of this game mode base class. When our engine started off, they started off as a game engine for FPS games, their own game called Unreal Tournament. And this game mode class was really made for an FPS type game like that. So it has some match state events in there that you can actually call inside of the event graph. Now later on, when they started to see that Unreal Engine also became more popular for single player games, they also added this game mode base class. And the game mode base class is the one they offer you here by default. But for multiplayer, I always recommend using the GameMode class, because if you do want to use some of these handy events or functions that you can override, then I recommend this class. Also, one thing to keep in mind, when we type in the GameState class, then for the GameState we also see that we have a GameState base class like this, and then over here we also see that we have a GameState class. If right now we start to type game mode and select the game mode instead of the game mode base, then we must also create a game state class and not a game state base class. If you combine a game mode with a game state base class, for example, your game will break. So once you go down to not using the base classes, but the actual game state and game mode classes, then you have to use both of them. Alright, so the first thing we're going to do is type in game mode and create ourselves a game mode. Now we are going to call this one BP, which stands for blueprint, game mode, and let's just call it in this one framework. Since my category here for this tutorial, I call it framework, so I'm just going to add an acronym of framework on the end of all of these. Okay, then the next class we're going to create is going to be that game state class. So let's type in game state. Okay, so let me explain to you a little bit about what a game state is. Well, essentially, as the name already suggests, it keeps track of the state of your game. A good thing to know is that the game state is also replicated, so any information that you set here on the server gets replicated down to every single client. So let's create one of these as well. Call this blueprint GS, which stands for game state, and let's call it framework as well. Then the next class we're going to create is called a player controller. You can find that one over here. For the player controller, there's no player controller base class or anything like that, so it's just a player controller. A player controller is basically you as the keyboard controlling your player. Whether that's a pawn, a car, or an actual humanoid player, this player controller actually represents you and the input that you do in your game. So if you click on your keyboard or on your mouse, for instance, the player controller represents that. So as it says here in our engine's own description, a player controller is an actor responsible for controlling a pawn used by the player. Okay, let's create one of these and let's call it blueprint _ PC and then framework. All right. So as they said in their own description, it's responsible for controlling a pawn. Well, that is true, but a player controller can also handle a lot more. And one very important thing for a player controller is that it's a very useful place to spawn all of your user interface from, and also to manage all of your user interface from. And I'll show you guys in a minute why that is. And I'll show you guys in a minute when we get into this class why that is so. All right, then the next class that we want to create is back to blueprint class here is a PlayerState class. So let's hover over it and read what it says again. A player state is created for every player on a server. Player states are replicated to all clients and contain network relevant information about the player, such as the player name, score, etc. What this means is that by default, this class has a couple of functions and a couple of variables. And one of those variables, as they display here, is for instance the player name or the score of a player. So basically this keeps track of the state. So you would save things here, such as for instance your username. Perhaps you would save other replicated information here, such as for instance your guild ID. Perhaps you want to show your experience or the level that you are as a player. Or perhaps you want to show something like a player title, like you could be Kekdot the epic adventurer. So let's hit player state and hit select and call this BPPS, which stands for player state framework. All right. Then the next thing we're going to do is that we want to have one user interface class, and we click on user widget and let's call this WB, which stands for widget blueprint framework example. Let's call it that. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is now hit save all. And then what we need to do is that we need to assign this game mode to this level in order for this to work. So here we click on blueprint game mode framework. And then we see that by default, this framework is set up that it has a default pawn, HUD class, player controller, and stuff like that. Now we can add all of these classes here. So the classes that we created over here, we can add them over here. But what you can also do is open up your game mode, click on class defaults, and then you can set them over here. So whatever you prefer, do it like that. So the first thing we're going to assign here is GameState class. So for that one, we're going to select our BPGS framework. Then we're going to go to the PlayerController class. Here we click on PlayerController, BPPC framework, and then the PlayerState is the last one we have to assign, BPPS framework. All right, now let's hit compile and save. Save all, and as you see, they are now assigned to this game mode. So what happens right now when I hit play? Well, I just become some flying thing, and this flying thing that I am right now is actually this default bond that our engine has given us. So the first thing I want to do is switch this out to a character. So we have a character here called Blueprint third person character. It's just from the third person template, and right now if I hit play, I actually spawn this guy. Alright, now that we have this base setup out of the way, I want to explain to you how this framework works and where each of these classes exist. So does this one exist on the server, for instance? Does it also replicate to the client? Let's take a look at that right now. So I made this little actor here, and inside of this actor in the event graph, we have some information about where these classes exist. So let's first of all look at the game mode, since the game mode is the very first class that gets initialized and sets all of the other relevant classes. Okay, so basically, as we know, game mode handles rules and stuff like that. So where does this guy exist? Well, it exists on the server only. So what does that mean? Well, that means that the clients do not even have a copy of the game mode. So the clients cannot get any information from the game mode, and they can also not communicate with the game mode directly. They can if they do RPCs, but then they have to make an RPC which they fire off to the server first, and then once the client is on the server, they can at that point basically communicate with the game mode. So let's say that in the game mode you install an event that is called respawn player. What you can then do is that from your player controller, which as we see exists on the server and the owning client, then what you can do is that from the owning client of the player controller, and to understand what owning client means, I wrote it down over here. Owning client is the player who owns the actor. So basically, when you spawn into the world, you own a player controller, and you own that on your local computer. So you have over here, you have you on your PC, basically. Let's make this a bit smaller. But then your player controller, your exact one, also exists on the server. So your PC on the server. So there's two versions of your player controller, basically. That's what PC stands for. There's the one that you have locally, and there's the one that exists on the server that is always correcting the one that you have locally in case you are replicating information down from this player controller to this one. Okay, so let's say that the player controller wants to respawn their player, and that respawn events exist on the game mode. Well, in that case, first we have to go from the owning client locally to the server, and then once on the server, we can then call the game mode and activate an event there. So to look at that in action, we can type in custom event, and we can call this respawn player. Okay, so let's say that this event exists on my player controller. Then what we can, for instance, do is that we can do keyboard button P, for instance. So let's say I want to respawn my player on my player controller. I can then on my keyboard press P, and I can then call the respawn player event. Well, since this is just a regular event and it's not replicated, this will just happen on the owning client and on the local version of my player controller. So now that we want to do the respawn and the actual logic is here safe server side only on the game mode, we have to go to the server first. So in this case, we would then create another event, and we would call this SR, which stands for server respawn player. And this event we would then set to run on the server, and we would make it reliable, since this is an important event that we need to make sure actually comes through the network. So in that case, we can then press P to call the respawn player event, and the respawn player event can then call the respawn player server event that exists. And what we do right now is that basically we were on the owning client side over here. And at this point over here, we breached that gap from going from the owning client version of our player controller to the server side version of our player controller. So we went from owning client to server. And now that we are on the server, and since the game mode only exists on the server, we can now communicate with that game mode and call an event there. So let's say that over here we have an event called spawn player, right? And that event we do not have to set to run on the server, because as you see over here, everything that happens on the game mode is always ran on the server. So on the server, you do not have to use any of that run on server stuff. So what we can do right now is that over here, you could now basically get your game mode. What you would then typically do is that you would cast to your game mode. So you would cast to and find your game mode class. So this one. And then on your game mode, that is what this reference is, you would then call that spawn player event. But since we are now in an actor class blueprint, all of this is inside of an actor class blueprint, I cannot actually make this work, but this is just an example of how that would work. So if you would do that cast, so let's bring it back actually, if you would do that cast, then it would look something like this, spawn player, boom. So basically this logic would run through the cast, and then on the cast you would spawn that player inside of that game mode. All right, so now that we understand that, then let's look at the following class. Let me move this over here a little bit so we have a bit more space. So this is all inside of your player controller. Okay, now that we know that the game mode only exists on the server, let's look at the game state. So the game state, as we know, it had information about the state of our game. So what can that be, for example? Well, the state of our game could, for instance, in a team-based game, mean that we have a score of team A, and that we, for instance, have a score of team B. And as we see over here on the top, the game state exists both on the server and on the clients. So that would mean if we set this type of information, such as a team score, let's say that the team score is 5 for team A and 2 for team B, then this GameState class can replicate that information down to all of the clients. And that means that we can now have a global place where we can store this type of information and have that global place with all that information basically be available for the clients to fetch their information from. So what would something like that look like in actual code? Well, let's move this down a little bit. It would simply look like this. Anywhere where you are a client, so that could be in your player controller or in your widget, because your widget is owned by your player controller. I'll get to that in a little bit. Then basically what that means is that on any of these classes, such as for instance the player controller, let's say that I on my player controller would want to pull this team score so that from my player controller I can then set that information in my widget. Or let's say that from my widget I would want to get that team score, then I could basically from my widget make a call to the game state to get the information there. So let's say I want to display in my widget, I want to display team A score. Then what I can do in my widget is run this code where I can type get game state. And then we would also have to cast to the blueprint game state. Casting is basically making a phone call to another blueprint, and then we can fetch all the information that's available in that blueprint. So if this variable exists in the game state, we will now be able to get the team score. So what that would look like is that this information here would basically come out of here. And now our widget could be updated locally with the information from that game state. All right, now that we kind of understand what the game state is, then let's take a look at the player state. So as we saw before, and as the name indicates, this class keeps track of the state of the player. And also this class exists both on the server and on the client. So basically, what is this useful for? Well, as we read before, this could, for instance, contain your username. Let's say that your username, you want to have it replicated. You would then put that username over here. So why would you not store your username in your player controller? Well, because as we see over here, player controller only exists on the server and the owning client. And the owning client is basically you, the guy or girl behind the keyboard and mouse. So that means if the player controller only exists on the server and on the owning client, then what about all of the other connected clients that would also want to know your username? Well, there we already see the problem with the player controller. And because of that, we want to store this type of information not here, but in the player state where it's supposed to be. Alright, now that we understand why the player state is useful, then let's look at the pawn class. And one of the most famous pawn classes is what we call the character class. So that is basically this guy that you can walk around with. So usually in video games, a character might have health, and your health might go down and your character might die and have to respawn. So if we have a variable called health, then where do we store that? Well, you could, for example, store it on your player controller again, but then we have the same problem as with the username. The other clients will never know about your health. And if the other clients don't know about your health, then how can they base logic on your health and see that you have, for instance, only 10 HP left? Well, because of that, we do not want to install this yet again in the player controller, but we want to install it in a class that exists both on the server and the client. And what you would preferably want is that when your character dies, that your health variable dies with the character. So that basically answers the question why you do not install your health on your player state. Because if you install your health on your player state, then in the scenario that your character dies, you would have to then reset your health. So a more clean way to do it is to install the health where it belongs with the character, have it die with the character, and then once the character respawns, have that health variable automatically be reset because it has a default value that you simply set inside of that variable. Alright, now that we understand the pawn class as well, we looked at most of the framework and most of the imported classes here. Then another good thing to know is that there is a relationship between the player controller and the pawn class. And so you could basically draw a line here between the player controller and the pawn class. And the relationship is the following. Let's get this out of this example and copy it over here. Alright, the relationship between these two is that the player controller is basically above the character class. And also input wise. So let's say that you have your keyboard over here, right? And that you press buttons on your keyboard. And then let's say the same for the pawn class. Let's say that for the pawn class, you also have some buttons that you can press. So let's get one of those buttons. Let's do this one, P. So let's say here I can press P, and over here I can also press P. Now, how does this work basically? Well, if P is also installed on the player controller and also on the pawn, then the one on the player controller is the only one that gets consumed. If there is no P event on the player controller, then the pawn consumes it. So there's a real relationship between the player controller and the pawn, where first Unreal Engine checks if the player controller consumes the input, and if it doesn't, then the pawn will basically consume that input. So that's very handy to know. And why is that handy to know? Well, let's say, for example, that here in the player controller, we have a button and we want this button to spawn some user interface. Let's say P wants to spawn a pause menu. Well, in that scenario, you would then basically install P on the player controller and it would consume the input here first. So now P is basically already gone for us and we can no longer use it in the character because every time we press it, the player controller simply consumes it. So that means on the character here, we can no longer use that. So we will have to assign some other buttons like button D, for instance. So that's just one important thing to understand. Then another important thing to understand is that player controllers can possess pawns. So essentially, since the pawns are basically created on both the server and the client, they just exist in the world. So upon spawning of a character, it just stands there and nobody owns it. But then you have to have an owner that controls the pawn. And that owner can then be you, the player controller. So as soon as this player controller possesses the pawn, then the player controller becomes the owner of the pawn. And at that point, basically the pawn will consume the input that you give as the player controller. But first it will check if it was used here, and then finally your player controller input is then actually used here in your pawn class. Alright, then you might have the following question. Why does the pawn class exist on clients and not on the owning client? Well, as you can imagine, if you were to have two players spawned as a listen server like this, the whole goal of your pawn is that you can both see it on the left instance here, on the client instance, and on the right instance here. So that's the reason why the pawn does not only exist on you as the client, because if that were the case, then it would actually look something like this. this is a good example for basically only having something on the owning client. So now I have my character here, and in this instance here on the left, I have my character here, but they do not see each other because this is now testing in standalone, which means I only see my character on my owning client, and this guy only sees his character on his owning client. So that is basically why a character exists on the server and on the client. All right, then let's talk about the very last example over here. Let's reset this. And that is basically widgets. So then what are widgets in this entire picture, and how do widgets relate to these classes? Well, widgets only exist on owning clients. So just like the example I just showed you with that character only being visible to me in that scenario, that's the same with widgets. Widgets are basically drawn on top of your screen, and you only want them to be visible for the owning client. And every connected owning client can have widgets. So what do I recommend when it comes to widgets? Well, I recommend that your player controller, who is also existing on the owning client, that your player controller spawns your widgets. A good thing to know about widgets can never be replicated or anything like that. And that is, of course, again, because they only exist on the owning client. So having your player controller spawn and create all of your widgets and also managing them is a very good idea, because now your player controller can manage your owning client widget, and then you can have a relationship between the player controller sending information from the server down to the owning client. Then this owning client side of the player controller can send that information over to the widget and have it be displayed to you as the user. And then let's say, for example, that you want to respawn your player, right? But you do not want to do it with the press of a button inside of your player controller. No, you want to actually handle that with an actual button inside of your user interface. Well, in that scenario, there's also a good relationship between these two, and that is that let's say you have a button installed inside of your widget that you want to press. Well, when you press it over here, you have your owning client widget communicate to your owning client player controller, and then on the owning client of the player controller, instead of having this P event, you could simply have the widget call this respawn event that exists in the owning client of your player controller. And then from there, you can have your player controller call an event on the server, and your server side player controller can then call that event anywhere in these classes, in the GameState, in the PlayerState, or in the GameMode, or in your pawn class, for example. So now your widget can communicate with the player controller, and your player controller can then respawn your character. Alright guys, I think this is quite a long video already, so I'm going to wrap it up over here. In the next video, I'm going to take a closer look at the game mode and what events are actually inside of there. Then we are also going to look at the game state and which events are inside of there, at the player state, at the pawn, at the player controller, and at the widgets. And basically in the next video, we are going to set each and every one of these classes up with some useful code and a really good example of how these classes are best used. And I'll just simply show you some best practices of what to code here, what I recommend you code here, here, and here. Alright guys, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye bye.